3 weeks after Kelsford, Marcus Webb found himself standing at the kitchen window of a borrowed farmhouse in Beaufort County, watching the far field and drinking bad instant coffee and thinking about Dale Harmon's brisket rub. Not because he was hungry. He hadn't been properly hungry in 3 weeks. He thought about it because it was the specific, irrational, profoundly human thing Dale had done, keeping the recipe locked behind his teeth, not from competition, not from legal concern, but from the pure small pleasure of being the keeper of something, of having a thing that was entirely his. He thought about this the way you think about a thing that matters and you can't quite say why. The wallet landed on the counter between them like a dropped grenade. Marcus Webb stared at it. Worn brown leather, the corner stitching fraying where he'd caught it on a fence post 3 years ago, the little loop of red thread his daughter Nora had tied around the zipper pull so he'd stop losing it in his coat pockets. He hadn't lost it. He'd had it on him when the town of Kelsford stopped being a town and started being something else entirely. The girl who put it there was maybe 8 years old, and she was not human. He knew that the way you know a sound isn't right even before you figure out why, a baseline wrongness registering in the gut before the brain catches up. She was shaped like a child. 2 arms, 2 legs, a face with the right number of features in roughly the right places. But her skin had a faint luminescence the color of old bioluminescent fungus, a blue-green shimmer that wasn't quite visible until the light caught it sideways. Her pupils were horizontal, like a goat's. Her fingers were one too many on each hand, and she held herself very still in a way no 8-year-old human holds herself still, the stillness of something that has learned what stillness means to the creatures it's studying, and is performing it carefully. She looked up at him. Those horizontal pupils tracked him the way a camera tracks movement, slow and precise. "You dropped this," she said. Her English was perfect. That was almost worse. Marcus Webb had been a sheriff's deputy for 11 years before the Kelsford incident, which was what the government was calling it in the documents he wasn't supposed to have read, and what he was calling it in his own head, because the alternative was saying what it actually was out loud, and he wasn't ready for that yet. He had faced down a man with a shotgun in a Kroger parking lot. He had pulled 3 people out of a car wreck in the dark with his bare hands while the engine leaked fuel onto the asphalt. He had, twice in his career, told families their people weren't coming home. None of that had prepared him for this. "Thank you," he said, because 11 years of being a deputy had trained him to stay calm when he had no idea what else to do. The girl nodded. She did not leave. Marcus picked up the wallet. The red thread was still there. He could feel, without opening it, that everything was inside: cards, cash, the folded photo of Nora from her 6th birthday, the one where she'd gotten frosting on her nose and hadn't known. He checked for that photo 100 times in the last 3 weeks, lying in the cot at the FEMA processing center, needing to know it still existed. "How did you find this?" he asked. "In the field," she said, "near the place where the fire was." The place where the fire was. That was one way to put it. 31 days ago, the town of Kelsford, South Carolina had woken up and started dying. Not all at once. That would have almost been cleaner. It had gone slow and wrong, the way a tooth goes wrong, everything seeming fine right up until the moment it obviously wasn't. Dale Harmon had come back from hunting different. Not visibly different, not right away. He was still Dale, still doing Dale things, still showing up at the VFW on Tuesday nights and arguing about college football. But there was something in the way he looked at people, something that was cataloging rather than seeing. The thing was, Dale had always been Dale. Big man, loud laugh. The kind of person who remembered every kid's birthday in a 3-block radius and showed up at youth football games even when his own son had graduated 6 years prior. He'd won the county brisket championship 4 times running and was insufferable about it in the best possible way, the way you're insufferable about a thing when the people who love you genuinely want you to be. He made his rub from scratch, a blend he'd been refining for 11 years. He would not share the recipe. Not with his own kids. Not with his wife, who he claimed could never keep a secret. Not with anyone ever, under any circumstances, for any reason. He had taken the recipe's existence to levels that had become Kelsford legend, referenced at town meetings and 4th of July speeches, and once, memorably, at his mother-in-law's retirement party. That was Dale Harmon. That was who he was. The version of Dale that came back from hunting in the woods east of town had Dale's face and Dale's voice and Dale's habit of cracking his knuckles when he was thinking. But when you talked to him, you got the distinct and queasy sensation of talking to something that was running Dale from the outside, like a hand in a glove. The hand knows what a glove is supposed to do, but it doesn't know why. And the why, it turned out, was everything. Marcus had noticed it the third Tuesday, and filed it away in that part of his mind, reserved for things that weren't yet problems, which he'd later understand was the most expensive filing system he'd ever maintained. The hive mind aspect was the part Marcus kept getting stuck on. Not just because of what it meant, every infected person in Kelsford thinking the same thoughts, feeling the same hunger, their individuality dissolving like sugar in warm water, but because of the small ways it showed. Mrs. Pendleton at the pharmacy humming the same 3 bars of something over and over. The Abernathy kids riding their bikes in perfect synchronized circles for 40 minutes without speaking. A dozen people at the diner all looking up from their meals at exactly the same moment to watch a bird cross the window. You saw it and you didn't see it. Your brain, trained on normal, would find the normal explanation. You are tired. You are stressed. You are looking for problems that aren't there. The infected didn't know they were infected. That was the cruelest part. They went about their days with the absolute conviction that they were still themselves, that their hunger for raw meat was a dietary thing, that their difficulty remembering the words to songs was just age, that the way they all looked up at the same time was coincidence. The entity wore them like the glove, and the glove didn't know. By the time he understood what was happening, it had already happened to 40% of the town. The organism, the government documents didn't have a better word and neither did Marcus, had arrived in a meteorite fragment that landed in the woods outside town. That part was almost funny in retrospect. The woods outside town, where hunters had been walking for generations, where kids went to drink cheap beer and watch for satellites. Something had ridden the inside of a rock across however many light years, and it had landed in the most ordinary place imaginable, and it had waited. It was patient, whatever it was, patient and old and utterly indifferent to what it was doing to the people it touched, the same way a river is indifferent to whether you drown in it. It wasn't malicious. Marcus had thought about this a lot in the 3 weeks since Kelsford. He'd been very, very clear that it wasn't malicious. Malicious would have been easier to hate. What it was hungry and thorough. Dale Harmon had found it first and become something that was still partially Dale. The way a house is still partially the house it was before a fire, the frame surviving, the structure there, but everything inside rearranged and made wrong. The organism worked through contact, and through the secondary stage, the larvae that the infected produced and dispersed, and the larvae moved through the water table and through proximity, and through the air itself in certain conditions. And once they were inside a person, that person was still mostly there, still walking and talking and going to the VFW on Tuesdays. Only the VFW on Tuesdays was now a coordination point for the hive. Marcus had been immune. That was the word the government doctors used, immune. As though he'd been vaccinated, as though there was something his body had done right that everybody else's had failed at. He didn't know why. He'd stopped asking why because there was no answer that was going to make it feel better. He'd been outside the perimeter when the dispersal event happened. That was the other word they used, dispersal event. The moment the infected Brenda woman had released the secondary stage larvae into the water table and the surrounding air, and within 6 hours, the infection rate had gone from 40% to 93%. He'd been driving back from a welfare check 6 miles out on County Road 14, where the pines grew close enough to the asphalt that in winter their shadows would frost the road. He'd heard the radio go strange, not static, not loss of signal, but wrong in a way he couldn't name, like a voice he recognized saying something in a language he didn't know. And he'd pulled the cruiser over on the shoulder and sat there while the part of his brain that had always been very good at pattern recognition assembled something out of the scattered data points of the last 2 weeks and told him, quietly and with great certainty, do not go back. He had not gone back. He had called Nora from a gas station payphone because his cell was dead, and he'd told her he loved her and to go to Aunt Rose's in Atlanta, and she had said, "Daddy, you're being weird," and he had said, "I know, baby, please," and she had gone. She had listened. That was the thing he came back to in the dark. She had listened. What he knew was that he was one of 19 people who had walked out of Kelsford when the army went in. 19 out of 4,312. He knew that because the number was tattooed behind his eyes and would be there when he died. The girl was still watching him. "What's your name?" he asked. A pause. The kind of pause that wasn't uncertainty about whether to share the name, but uncertainty about whether the concept applied. "Vale," she said. "That is the closest sound." "Okay," Marcus said. "Vale, my name is Marcus." "I know," she said. "It is in the wallet." "Right, of course." He stood in the doorway of the farmhouse that the government had lent him, while they figured out what to do with the 19 survivors of Kelsford. It was a nice farmhouse, in a rural stretch of Beaufort County that had nothing to do with Kelsford, far enough away that he couldn't see the cordon perimeter from his windows. They'd given him a farmhouse and a caseworker named Tennell who called every 3 days and asked about his sleep and his appetite. He ate fine. He slept the way you sleep when exhaustion finally wins out over the pictures behind your eyelids. Vale stood at the base of his porch steps. She was wearing clothes that almost looked like clothes, a gray shirt, dark pants, small shoes that were slightly wrong somehow in a way he couldn't name. The cut was right. The fabric moved right. But something about the proportions was off by a fraction, the collar slightly too wide, the seams slightly too precise, the shoes slightly too symmetrical between left and right. Not store-bought wrong. Constructed from observation wrong. The government knew about the other survivors. He doubted they knew about this. "Are you alone?" he asked. "Near here," she said. "My parent cluster is in the far field." He didn't ask what a parent cluster was. "Are you afraid of me?" Another pause, longer this time. "I am," she said slowly, trying to understand the question. He pulled the porch chair around and sat down on the steps instead, because he was a large man, and he'd found that sitting made conversations easier when one party was significantly smaller than the other. Nora had taught him that, back when she was small enough that his size was a thing she had to work around. Nora was in Atlanta now with his sister. He'd called her every day for 3 weeks. She sounded okay. She sounded like a kid who didn't fully understand what had almost happened, which was the best possible outcome and the thing he was most grateful for. She asked when he was coming home, and he said soon, and it was the only lie he'd allowed himself. "Where are you from?" he asked Vale. She looked up briefly at the sky. She didn't point. He got the impression pointing wasn't something her kind did much. Just looked up, like the answer was directional information she was offering him. "Far," she said. "How long have you been here?" "My parent cluster arrived during the warm season, before the fire." She said it carefully, the way someone says a thing they know is loaded. "Before what was done to your settlement." He noticed she said what was done, not what happened. That was a distinction, and he filed it. "Did you see it?" he asked. "What happened to Kelsford?" "Yes." "Did your people—" He stopped. He didn't know how to ask the question. He tried again. "Was it your kind that did it?" Vale tilted her head. The movement was slightly too fluid, the neck having more articulation than a human neck would, and he didn't look away because looking away felt like a failure. "No," she said. "What came from the rock, we call it the Devourer without end. It is very old. It is not us." A pause. "We fled from it across a long time it followed." Marcus sat with that for a moment. Something ancient enough to cross interstellar distances, and these beings, these luminescent, too still beings in the far field, had been running from it. Had ended up here in Beaufort County, South Carolina. Had watched what it did to Kelsford. "I'm sorry," he said, "that you had to see that." He meant it. He watched her process it. "You are expressing sorrow," she said, "on behalf of my experience, not yours." "Yeah. That is," she stopped, started again. "In our language there is a word. It means the offering of your grief as a gift to another's grief. We do not have it in the sounds you use." "We call it condolence," Marcus said. "Condolence," she repeated, and the word in her mouth sounded like she was memorizing it, slotting it into a place that had been empty. He looked at his wallet. The red thread. Nora had tied it there because she was 6 and she wanted to help, and that was how she had decided to help, with a loop of red thread from her mother's sewing kit. And his daughter was alive in Atlanta right now because he'd been outside the Kelsford perimeter when the larvae dispersal hit the town center. He'd been driving back from a welfare check 6 miles out, and he'd heard the radio go strange, and he'd stopped the cruiser on the road and sat there while the part of his brain that had always been very good at pattern recognition assembled something out of the scattered data points of the last 2 weeks and told him do not go back. He had not gone back. He had called Nora from a gas station payphone because his cell was dead, and he'd told her he loved her and to go to Aunt Rose's in Atlanta. And she had said, "Daddy, you're being weird." And he had said, "I know, baby, please," and she had gone. He didn't know why he'd been spared. He didn't know what made him different from Dale Harmon, from the Strudemeyer family out on Old Mill Road, from the 30 or 40 people he'd known well enough to name. He'd asked the government doctors, and they'd taken vials of his blood and given him forms to sign and told him they were working on it. Vale was watching him with those horizontal pupils. "You are thinking about the ones you lost," she said. "Yeah." "I recognize the expression," she said. "My parent cluster wore it for a long time, after our previous world." He looked at her. "You lost a world." "3," she said. "To the Devourer without end, it is patient, it is thorough, it does not hate, it only," she searched for the word, "expands." 3 worlds. He thought about Kelsford and couldn't get his head around 3. Couldn't get his head around the mathematics of that grief. "How do you keep going?" he asked, and the question surprised him because it was the one he'd been asking himself in the dark of the farmhouse, and he hadn't meant to let it out. Vale was very still for a moment. "We remember," she said, "and we learn, and we do not let it happen to the next world we find." Something in the way she said it made him look up at her. "Is that why you're here, on Earth? We have been watching for cycles of your time, long before the rock arrived." A pause. "We have watched many of your settlements. We have watched you build and argue and destroy and build again. We have watched you make art from your suffering. We have watched you," another pause, and he got the sense she was choosing carefully. "We have watched you survive things that should have ended you, many times. And that impressed you." "It did not impress us," she said. "It confused us, and then it interested us, and then we came to believe it was the most important thing we had ever observed in the living universe." Marcus turned the wallet over in his hands, the red thread, the photograph inside because he knew it was there. "And then Kelsford," he said. "And then Kelsford." Something shifted in her expression, or in whatever passed for expression in her face. He was getting better at reading it, the minute variations around her horizontal pupils, the tension in those extra fingers. "We could not stop it. We tried to warn you," she gestured at the general concept of organized human authority. "Your coordination structures, 3 cycles of your time before the rock arrived. We could not make ourselves understood. 3 years. They tried to warn them 3 years ago and no one had understood. He thought about the things that crossed his desk in 3 years, the noise of ordinary crisis management, the 1,000 things that looked like the important thing and weren't, and he understood without pleasure how it might have been missed. You could have shown yourselves, he said, made them pay attention. We debated this extensively, a pause that carried the exhaustion of a very long argument. Your kind, when frightened, become, she searched for the word again, hostile. Without information, without time to process. We have seen it in many species. It is not a flaw. It is a survival mechanism for a certain kind of threat, but it does not help against this threat. He couldn't argue with that. What do you want? He asked. From me, right now. You could have just dropped the wallet on the porch. Vale was still for a long moment. Then she did something he hadn't seen her do yet. She sat down, crossing her legs on the bottom porch step, making herself smaller, and she looked up at him with those impossible eyes and she said, I wanted to see a survivor. He didn't say anything. We have studied the records of your battles, your wars, your great disasters, she said. We have read the documents and the histories and the accounts. But we have never, she stopped. I have never stood next to one. I wanted to know what it was, what it felt like in the air around you. And, he said, his voice came out lower than he expected. She was still for a moment. And, she said, it feels like the word you gave me, condolence, your grief and your continuation, both at the same time. He didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't sure there was something to say. He looked out at the field. The afternoon light was doing something complicated with the long grass, turning it gold and amber in patches where the wind moved through. Ordinary Beaufort County light. Nothing about it looked like the location of first contact between the human species and an intelligent alien civilization, which he supposed was fitting. Kelsford hadn't looked like the location of anything either, right up until it did. How long have you been on Earth? He asked. My parent cluster arrived during your warm season, before the rock. She said it with a care that told him she knew the weight of it. We detected the devourer without end in your system's outer boundary 6 of your years ago. We came as quickly as we were able. You came to warn us. We came to try. We reached out to your coordination structures, your large-scale organizational entities, the ones that manage planetary threats. We used frequencies we had learned from your transmissions. A pause. They did not understand us as intelligence. They categorized the signals as interference. He thought about that. Radio transmissions that looked like noise. A warning that arrived as static. He thought about all the filtering systems, all the protocols that existed precisely to sift meaningful signal from background noise, and how a message from beings who had never before communicated with humans would look, by definition, like the most sophisticated noise any instrument had ever encountered. And then Kelsford happened, he said. And then Kelsford. Something in her expression shifted, the minute variations around her horizontal pupils, the tension in those extra fingers that he was learning to read. We watched. We could not intervene directly. We did not know yet how your kind would respond to our presence, and we were afraid. She stopped. We were afraid that the response would be, that fear would. That we'd shoot first, he said. That your coordination structures would respond to an unknown entity appearing during a crisis with, she paused. Yes, shoot first. He couldn't argue with that. 3 worlds, he said. You've lost 3. 3. Tell me about them. She was still for a long moment. Then she said, the first was water. Most of the life was water-based. They had built, she paused, searching. We do not have the word in your sounds, structures that were also songs, architecture that was also music. You played them by moving through them. She was quiet for a moment. The devourer without end reached them first through the deep ocean channels. By the time we understood what was happening, most of the song structures were silent. She looked at her hands. We fled. They were gone. I'm sorry, he said. The second world was older than ours, more advanced. They had weapons and shields and coordination systems we had never conceived of. We thought we believed that technology was the answer, that sufficient force applied correctly. She stopped. It is not about force. The devourer without end does not fight, it absorbs. You cannot wage a war against something that does not wage a war back. It only expands. Every weapon we fired became part of it. Every defense we built, it moved around. We lost the second world, and the beings there lost 2/3 of their number in 16 of your days. She paused. The ones who survived hated us for a time, for not being able to save them. We understood the hatred. He sat with that, the weight of it, the scale of it. And the third. The pause before the third was the longest. The third was most like here, she said, beings that walked upright, that built cities and families and arguments and art, that had words for joy and grief, that made music that was only music, not also architecture, that kept secrets for pleasure. Her horizontal pupils tracked something distant, something he couldn't see. We were with them at the end, those of us who reached them in time. We could not stop it, but we were there. And a scholar there in the last days, she found something. She said, Vale searched for the translation. She said that the devourer without end was ancient and patient, and it had eaten 1,000 worlds, but it had never once produced a new sound. It only repeated the sounds it absorbed. It had no original note. It was infinite repetition with no source. She paused. She said, find the crack in the thing that cannot create. The crack is the original note. Marcus turned this over slowly. The things it can't model, he said. Yes. The specific things, the brisket rub, Nora's thread, the bottle caps Carl organized in a system that made no sense to anyone but Carl. He looked at her. You were watching Kelsford. Yes, for a long time before the rock. You saw those things. We saw those things. And we saw, when the entity tried to replicate them through the infected, it could not. It could replicate function. It could replicate behavior. It could make the version of Dale Harmon who attended the VFW and argued about football. But it could not replicate the brisket rub. It did not understand why the rub existed. It attempted, 11 times, to extract the recipe from Dale Harmon's memory through the infected persons around him. Each attempt produced technically accurate information and something that was completely wrong in a way that resisted definition. She paused. Because the rub was not about the recipe. The rub was about Dale Harmon being the man who kept the recipe. You cannot copy a keeper by copying only what is kept. He pressed his thumb against the red thread for a long moment. The third world scholar, he said, did she survive? No, but her words did. Vale touched the pocket where the small device lived. We have the names of billions of beings from 3 worlds. We speak them in certain seasons, so that the devourer without end does not have the last word. She looked at him steadily. It cannot consume a name that is being spoken. It cannot absorb a memory that is being held. After a while he said, your parent cluster, the ones in the far field, they know you're here. Yes. They let you come alone. A pause. They debated this also, extensively. Despite everything, something pulled at the corner of his mouth. You debate a lot. We have lost 3 worlds to impulsive action, she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't dry humor exactly, but was adjacent to it, and he recognized the shape of it, the deflection through understatement, the joke that isn't a joke, that humans do when the real thing is too heavy to hold in the open. I'd probably debate a lot too, he said. She looked at him. You said your daughter is safe. He hadn't told her that. His expression must have done it. I can perceive certain biochemical signals, she said neutrally. When you first looked at the wallet, your distress markers changed. They became, she tilted her head, relief mixed with grief, the pattern of someone whose central concern has been confirmed as safe. Yeah, he said. She's safe. Her name is in your wallet also, Nora. Yeah. That is a good name, Vale said, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has studied the concept of good names. He looked at her, this being who had crossed something unimaginable to land in Beaufort County, who had sat down on his porch step and made herself small so she wouldn't frighten him, who had debated extensively before deciding to return a worn brown wallet with a red thread on the zipper pull, because she wanted to stand next to a survivor. What do you want from humans? He asked, not from me, the larger question. Vale was quiet for a moment. We want to learn, she said, what you know about the devourer without end, what you experienced, how it worked within your biology. What made some of you resistant? A pause. And we want to teach what we know about it, what we have learned from 3 worlds of failure. She looked at him steadily. We cannot fight it alone. We have proven this. We have lost 3 worlds proving this. And you think we can? We think, she said carefully, that we have never encountered a species that survives the way your kind survives, through loss, through the making of meaning from loss, through the stubborn, irrational insistence on continuation. She paused. The devourer without end feeds on consumption. It does not understand contribution. It does not understand a being that would tie a thread on a wallet so another being does not lose what matters to them. He looked down at the red thread. He looked at it for a long time. That's my daughter, he said. She was 6. Yes, Vale said. I know. And she tied it and you kept it and you have touched it in the dark every night since Kelsford and it has held you to the world. She paused. The devourer without end would not know what to do with that. It cannot consume what it cannot understand. That is the only advantage we have ever found against it. The afternoon light was going gold and long across the field behind her. Somewhere out there, past the far tree line, her parent cluster waited in whatever arrangement they rested in. He thought about them, beings who had watched 3 worlds die and kept moving, who had come here and tried to warn the coordination structures and failed and watched anyway, who had let a child-shaped member of their cluster walk across a field alone to return a wallet to a human survivor because the conversation needed to happen. He thought about Kelsford, about Dale Harmon going to the VFW on Tuesdays, about the thing that wasn't malicious, that was only hungry, only thorough, that moved from world to world in the dark between stars like a river moved through a landscape. He thought about Nora's red thread. Okay, he said. Vale looked at him. Okay, he said again, tell me what you need. She was still for a moment. He got the sense she was calibrating, checking the meaning behind the word against the biochemical signals she could read, making sure she wasn't misunderstanding. You will speak to your coordination structures, she said. I'll try. I don't know how much they'll listen. He paused. They didn't listen before. Before the message came from us, she said. Now it comes from a survivor of Kelsford. A pause. That is different. He thought about the government doctors with their vials of his blood, about Tennell calling every 3 days to ask about his sleep, about the FEMA processing center and the 19 people, most of whom he didn't know, who had also gotten out, about the classified documents he wasn't supposed to have seen, the ones that were heavy with euphemism and light on answers. They needed answers. They just didn't know they needed them from out there. What else? He said. You said you wanted something. What was it? Vale was quiet. It was a different quiet than her other silences, not calculation, not searching for words, but something closer to the pause before the actual thing. I wanted to ask, she said, if you would tell me about the ones you lost. He looked at her. Not for information, she said quickly. Not for our records. I wanted, she stopped, started again. On our previous worlds we collected names, of those taken by the devourer without end. We have the names of billions of beings across 3 worlds and we speak them in certain seasons, so that the devourer without end does not have the last word. She paused. It is the only way we know to fight the thing that cannot be fought directly. You remember forward, we remember backward, perhaps together. She stopped. His throat was doing something it hadn't done since the gas station payphone. He pressed his thumb against the red thread and breathed. The first one I knew well, he said when he could, was Dale Harmon. He argued about college football and he made the best brisket in Kelsford County and his daughter played clarinet. He paused. Third chair All-State junior year. He talked about it more than she did. Vale reached into the pocket of her almost correct pants and produced a small device that he couldn't see clearly, that seemed to record without being a recorder exactly, and she held it carefully and she said, "Dale Harmon." "Yeah," he said. "Tell me more about him," she said. So he did. The light went gold and then orange, and then the first stars came out, and Marcus Webb sat on the porch steps of a farmhouse in Beaufort County and told an 8-year-old alien child about Dale Harmon. About the brisket and the way Dale said your name when he saw you across a parking lot, like it was the best word he knew, and he was glad for the chance to use it. About Dale's daughter, the clarinet, the way Dale was prouder of her than she was of herself, and how one day she would have understood that and would have been glad. He told Vale about the Strutemere family, all 6 of them. The parents, the 4 kids. Emmett, who was 3, who had just 2 weeks ago stopped being afraid of the dark. They had celebrated that. Everyone had celebrated that small, hard-won independence, the nightlight going off for the first time, the parents texting their parents about it, the grandmother calling in to say well good for that boy. Nobody had known it would be one of the last things worth celebrating. He told her about Margaret from Dispatch. How she was funny in the quiet margins of things, the exhale timed exactly right, the raised eyebrow that said everything you needed to know without one word being spoken. How you had to pay attention to get Margaret. How paying attention to Margaret made you a better person, and nobody gave her credit for that. He told her about Deputy Trevor and the transfer to Charleston. 3 attempts, 2 funding denials, 1 bureaucratic technicality. The 4th request still sitting in the printer tray. Trevor had needed a pen from the pharmacy. Marcus had been covering his shift. He told her about the couple from the hardware store, married 40 years, who argued constantly and beautifully, who had made of their disagreements a whole language of devotion, who had died within the same hour of each other, and how that was the only mercy in it. He told her about Janelle, who ran the diner and had opinions on everything, about Carl, who collected bottle caps in a system that made sense to nobody but Carl, about Father Mike, who hadn't gotten used to the southern heat and probably never would have, and who made people feel seen in a way that was rarer than miracles. He told her about Wally, who was afraid of dogs and ran into a burning house to save someone's German shepherd anyway because the family was screaming, and Wally was inside before he'd had time to remember he was afraid. About Sheriff Beatty, who was 70 and should have retired and refused because he was right that the town needed him, right up until the day the town was gone. He told her about Mrs. Okonkwo, who ran the library, and who had fought the county for 4 years to get the building's roof properly repaired, not from personal frustration, but from the conviction that the books deserved better, that the accumulated knowledge of the human race deserved a roof that didn't leak. About Danny Cho, who was 18 and had just gotten into Clemson and was going to study engineering, and had told Marcus about it outside the gas station, with a specific kind of barely contained excitement that belongs only to people at the very beginning of the thing they are meant to do. He talked for a long time, and as the stars came out and the field went dark and the crickets started in the long grass, he found that he was giving Vale not just names but textures. The things that were particular that couldn't be copied because they had no function except that they were that person's. Dale's recipe, Emmett's nightlight, Margaret's exhale, Wally running toward the fire in spite of himself, Danny Cho at the beginning of his future. He talked until he had given her every name he could give her, which was not everyone, which would never be everyone, but it was everyone he could hold in his hands and offer. And Vale held the small device and repeated each name back until he confirmed the pronunciation, and did not rush him, and did not interpret, and simply held the names as they were given. When he got to the end, when the names ran out, when the weight of all the names he didn't have was finally larger than the names he did, Vale put away the small device. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for coming back," he said. She stood up, that too fluid movement, and she looked at him with the horizontal pupils, and she said, "You asked me before if I was afraid of you." "Yeah." "I understood the question after all," she said. "I think the answer is not afraid, but careful, in the way you are careful with something that matters." He didn't know what to say to that either. He was discovering there were a lot of things about this conversation he couldn't respond to in words, and that was okay, that the body communicated what the language couldn't get around, and apparently she could read that too. "Your parent cluster," he said. "Can I meet them?" "When you are ready," she said. "And the coordination structures?" "When you are ready," she said again. "We have waited a long time." "We can wait until you are ready." She walked back across the field, small and luminescent in the darkening air, and Marcus watched her go and then looked up at the sky that was filling with stars, the enormous ordinary sky over Beaufort County, and he thought about how many of those points of light had things orbiting them that were patient and hungry and utterly indifferent, and how many of them had things orbiting them that had lost 3 worlds and kept moving, and how in the great ledger of the universe, both of those things were true at the same time. He opened his wallet. He took out the photograph of Nora with the frosting on her nose. He sat with it in the last of the light. Then he went inside and called Tennell's number, the one she'd given him for emergencies. "Deputy Webb," she said, picking up on the second ring. "Is everything all right?" "No," he said, "but I know something you need to know, and I know someone you need to meet." He paused. "And I need you to get me in front of whoever makes the decisions, the real ones, not the people who hand out forms." Silence on the line. "This is important," he said. "Deputy Webb." "Tennell," he said. "Kelsford had 4,300 people in it, and it was one town in one county in one state on one planet." He paused. "I've just learned it's not the first, and it won't be the last, unless—" He stopped. "Just get me in the room, I'll explain the rest." Another silence. "Then give me an hour." He sat by the window while he waited, wallet in hand, thumb on the red thread. Outside, the far field was dark now, and he couldn't see the parent cluster from here, but he knew they were there, waiting with the patience of beings who had learned that patience was the only counter to something that moved on geological time. Humans didn't have geological time. Humans had Nora tying a red thread on a wallet with her 6-year-old fingers, and Dale Harmon's daughter making Allstate on clarinet, and Margaret from Dispatch being quietly funny in a way nobody gave her credit for. Humans had the 37 names he'd spoken into the dark of a Beaufort County field to a child with horizontal eyes who would carry them across the stars. That was what they had. That was the specific human thing, the thing the devourer without end couldn't eat because it couldn't understand it. You couldn't consume a red thread. You couldn't absorb what it meant. He understood something else now, sitting there waiting for Tennell to call back. He understood why Vale had come across the field alone to hand him a wallet. It wasn't just to return what he'd lost. It was to show him something. It was to show him that the most important message in the universe sometimes arrives in a worn leather wallet with a fraying corner and a loop of red thread, carried in the hands of something small and quiet that has been watching for a very long time, waiting for the right moment, and deciding at last. Now. Tennell called back in 40 minutes. "I have someone who wants to speak with you," she said, and her voice had changed. "Turns out your file has been flagged at a level I didn't know about. Deputy Webb, are you safe?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm safe." He paused. But tell whoever it is to bring people who are good at listening, really listening. What I'm about to say is going to sound, it's going to be hard to hear, but they need to hear it. There was a rustling, a muffled exchange, and then a new voice came on the line, older, careful, carrying the particular gravity of someone who had spent a career in rooms where the wrong answer had consequences. "Deputy Webb," the voice said, "my name is Hargrove. I understand you have information about Kelsford." "Not just Kelsford," Marcus said. "I have something better than that." He looked out at the dark field. "I have an introduction." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours and went in directions Hargrove had not prepared for, and Marcus told it straight, the way he'd been trained, facts first, then interpretation, then recommendation, and he did not soften it or hedge it or couch it in careful language that would make it easier to dismiss. He told it the way a good witness tells things, with specificity, without editorializing, because the facts were strange enough on their own. He told Hargrove about the organism in the rock, the things he'd observed in Dale Harmon and the others in the weeks before the dispersal event, the way the hive mind had shown itself in small wrong details before the crisis became visible. He told it about Mrs. Pendleton humming the same 3 bars, the Abernathy kids on their bikes, a dozen people in the diner looking up at exactly the same moment. He told it about the larvae dispersal and what it had done to Kelsford in 6 hours. He told it about immunity and the 19 survivors, and what the government's own classified documents were getting wrong in their descriptions of the organism's behavior. Then he told Hargrove about Vale. He told it slowly and did not hedge, and watched his own willingness to say it plainly as a kind of test of himself. He said, "There is a being in my far field who has been here since before Kelsford fell. Her kind has been here longer. They have been watching us." They tried to warn the coordination structures, and the coordination structures cataloged the signals as interference. They have lost 3 civilizations to this organism. They know things we desperately need to know, and they want to fight it, with us, because they cannot do it without us any more than we can do it without them. When he got to the part about what they'd found in the third world, the scholar's understanding, the crack in the entity, the original note, there was a very long silence on the other end of the line. "Deputy Webb," Hargrove said finally, "you're telling me these beings have been tracking this organism for—" "A long time," Marcus said. "Long enough to have lost 3 civilizations to it, long enough to come here and try to warn us. Long enough to let a child walk across a field alone in the dark, because they decided that was the right way to start the conversation." Another silence. "Why?" Hargrove said. "Why the child, why not?" "Because," Marcus said, and he hadn't quite worked this out until he said it, "something that shows up with a fleet and a weapons array is a threat. Something that shows up with your wallet alone and sits down on your steps, that's a neighbor." He paused. "They've been doing this a long time. They know the difference." He heard Hargrove breathing. "I want to meet them," Hargrove said. "I figured," Marcus said. "Vale told me when I'm ready, they're ready." "I think we're ready. Can you set it up?" Marcus looked out at the dark field and thought about Vale in it, luminescent, patient, with the horizontal eyes and the 11 fingers and the small device for recording names. "Yeah," he said, "I can set it up." He ended the call. He sat for a moment with the wallet in his hand. Then he went to the back door and opened it and stood in the frame looking out at the dark and the stars. After a moment he saw a light in the far field, blue-green faint, moving, coming toward him. He didn't move. He stood in the doorway and waited, because that was what you did. You stood in the doorway and you waited and you made yourself available and you did not run. Vale came across the grass. Behind her, further back, he could see the shapes of others, larger or differently shaped or more numerous. It was hard to tell in the dark. The parent cluster. She stopped at the edge of the porch light. "You called your coordination structures," she said. "Yeah. And they want to meet you," he said. "Is that okay?" She turned and looked back at the parent cluster, and there was an exchange between them that he couldn't hear or see exactly. Something that passed in frequencies or signals he didn't have access to, and then she turned back. "Yes," she said, "that is okay." "You're not afraid," he said, giving it back to her. She considered this. "We are," she said, "careful, in the way you are careful with something that matters." He smiled then. He hadn't done that in 31 days, hadn't had a reason that felt real. And it was small and it was tired, but it was genuine. And apparently she could read that too, because something in her face shifted to a register he was starting to recognize. Not a smile, her anatomy didn't do smiles, but the attempt to reflect it back. The attempt that was, in its way, a new note. "Come inside," he said. "I'll make coffee. You can tell me what you call the devourer without end in your language, and then you can tell me everything you know about how to fight it." She walked up the porch steps and past him through the door, and behind her the parent cluster moved closer across the field, slow and careful, with the patience of beings who had learned that patience was everything. Marcus Webb made coffee and sat across a kitchen table from Vale in the light of an ordinary farmhouse lamp, and they began. Not the battle. That would come, the long work of it, the coordination and the preparation and the trying to make governments and agencies and scientific communities understand what was out there, patient and hungry, moving through the dark between stars toward the next world and the next. There would be scientists who needed convincing and generals who would want weapons that didn't apply and politicians who would need the whole thing explained in terms of what they already understood, and the difficulty of explaining that this was not the thing they already understood. There would be days when the coordination structures wanted to respond to the devourer without end the way the Second World had responded, with force, with shields, with the conviction that sufficient firepower was sufficient. Marcus would have to explain, over and over, what Vale had told him, and what the Third World scholar had understood, that you cannot wage a war against something that does not wage a war back. That the response to an entity that only expands is not to expand your opposition, but to create things it cannot absorb, to make sounds it cannot replicate, to be specific and particular and irreducibly human in the ways that were not about survival, that made no strategic sense, that the devourer without end had never in 1,000 worlds been able to model. There would be days when it felt impossible, when the mathematics of the thing, how old it was, how many worlds it had consumed, the patience of something that measured time in stellar events, pressed down on the ordinary kitchen table and the ordinary coffee, and the ordinary fact of a man sitting across from a being from 3 lost worlds in a borrowed farmhouse in South Carolina. There would be days when the scale of it was a physical weight. But before the battle, there is always the moment of decision. The moment where you look at what's coming and you decide whether to face it or run, and running isn't really running because it follows you. And so the only real choice is to face it and figure out who else will stand with you and what you each bring to the standing. Marcus Webb brought 37 names and a fraying wallet, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had stood in a doorway and not run. He brought 11 years of pattern recognition, and the willingness to sit on porch steps and make himself smaller when that was what the conversation needed. He brought the specific human ability to hold grief and continuation in both hands simultaneously, to turn them over and over like a worn piece of leather, until you understood that the weight of one was exactly what powered the other. Vale brought 3 worlds of hard knowledge and the names of billions, and the understanding that the only thing in the universe the devourer without end couldn't process was the willingness of one being to tie a red thread on another being's wallet so they wouldn't lose what mattered. She brought the scholar's insight carried across light years. The crack is the original note, the thing it cannot create, the thing that only exists because a specific being made it in a specific moment for no survival reason, except that it was theirs. Outside, the parent cluster settled in the far field under the stars and waited, And for the first time in a long time, the waiting felt different. It felt like it might be worth it. In the morning, there would be a car on the long driveway carrying people from Hargrove's world, people who would sit at this same kitchen table and look at Vale with the focused stillness of professionals encountering the thing that changes all the categories. There would be vials of blood and forms in triplicate and the slow machinery of institutional response grinding into gear. There would be arguments and fear, and the particular human problem of dealing with something enormous, using tools built for something smaller. But there would also be coffee in a kitchen in Beaufort County, in a farmhouse lent by a government that had not yet understood what it was part of. And there would be a worn wallet with a red thread sitting on the table between a human man and a being from 3 worlds away, both of them carrying the names of people who were gone and had not been forgotten. And there would be, across the table, the slow hard work of understanding each other well enough to fight something that neither could fight alone. Marcus Webb poured coffee and pushed a mug toward Vale, who regarded it with the careful interest of someone encountering a ritual for the first time, and said, "Tell me your language's word for it first. The devourer without end. What do you actually call it?" She wrapped her 11 fingers around the mug, and said a word that was not a human word, that had edges and depths he could feel more than hear, a word that had been spoken across 3 worlds as a warning and a grief, and a reason to keep going. He repeated it back badly. She corrected him. He tried again. She corrected him again, with something in her expression that was adjacent to patience and adjacent to something lighter, precisely located at neither. He tried a 3rd time. "Better," she said. "I'll keep working on it," he said. "Yes," she said. "I think you will." And the stars outside the farmhouse window were the same stars that had watched 3 worlds fall and were watching this one now. Patient and old and indifferent in the way the universe is indifferent, offering nothing and taking nothing, only being there, only being witness to whatever the small, bright lives below them managed to do with the time they had. Marcus Webb touched the red thread one more time and picked up his coffee and got to work. Out in the far field, the parent cluster held still in the dark, and the names of billions of beings from 3 lost worlds were tucked inside a small device in Vale's pocket, waiting for the season when they would be spoken aloud. And in the morning, a car would come down a long driveway in Beaufort County, South Carolina, and the rest of the work would begin. But the work had already begun. It had begun the moment a child crossed a dark field with a wallet in her hands, choosing to start the conversation the one way that could not be misread as a threat. Quietly, alone, giving back something that had been lost, and asking for something in return that no one in the history of contact between species had ever thought to ask for. Tell me their names. Tell me who they were. Give me what the devourer without end cannot take and cannot copy and cannot consume, because it requires a specific, irrational, loving being to make it, and the devourer without end has never been that, and never will be. Give me Dale Harmon's brisket rub. Give me Emmett's nightlight. Give me Margaret's exhale and Trevor's pen and Nora's red thread. Give me what you are. And Marcus Webb had given it, name by name, in the darkening of a Beaufort County evening, and Vale had received it with both hands, all 11 fingers, and something in the long accounting of the universe had shifted by a fraction that might, in the end, be everything. That was enough. That was, in the final and honest accounting of things, exactly enough.